Welcome this evening and thank you for joining us at the Tetley. I'm really delighted to present today Samra Mayanja, who is in conversation with Sepake Angiama of Iniva in London. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us. There'll be some time at the end for some questions. So I'll give you both a little wave when we're kind of nearly done.
Thanks, Georgia. I wanted to start off by asking you a question about the title. So the title of this exhibition is The Living and the Stale. And I think in the video downstairs, in the interview with you, you kind of talked about your sort of fascination with things kind of going off and staleness, and actually sort of death and dying ultimately. And I just wondered if it's quite a morbid way to start, but I thought I'd better start with it than end with it.
Yeah.
So I thought I'd start with death and we can kind of move into the life of the show.
Yeah, sure. When I first moved to Leeds, I lived in this housing cooperative where everybody had like a different task, and like take the bins out, do recycling, mop the front room or whatever. And my job was the compost, to turn the compost, take it out, turn it all through the year. And it was like the shit job. Nobody wanted to do it. So I thought, I don't know anything about compost. And I kind of romanticized like my mother's like farming, agricultural family. And I thought, this is my way of being an urban farmer somehow, but not really farming, just contributing the soil. And then that kind of stoked an interest in, like decomposition and seeing things rot and decay and the smells and how you can kind of sense when things are like off in a good way and like off in a kind of bad way, where actually the soil is becoming like a bit toxic, or when you're not turning it enough and mice start to burrow inside and live there. And, it's like a whole kind of world there, but things are dying, but there is actually life and kind of new moments emerging there. And then I had this moment when the day I found out my grandfather had died, who is this kind of like patriarchal, not patriarchal, but the patriarch of my mother's family, and a farmer and a vet, and very vested in the land in Uganda. And when I got the phone call, I was turning the compost, and my mum said, Muzee, which means old man in my mother's language, Lusoga, Muzee's died. And I was turning the compost, and I thought, okay, well, I've just got to finish turning the compost. And I was crying, and, then in this kind of poetic, cinematic, maybe like 90s, like cinematic moment, I was like crying, and then it started raining, and my granddad's died, and and it was into the compost, and it further, somehow to me, there was this kind of poetic happening in this space, this sort of these two bays. And I always have this this thinking of decomposition in the making of a show. The fact that you kind of like give life to something, and I have certain groups of friends that think once it enters the gallery that the artwork dies, somehow it lives in the studio, it dies in the gallery. And that notion or that framework of decomposition, which is not new, I think, in the contemporary art world, it's not new, but I love it. I love it as a metaphor. I love it as a thing that I do, a thing that I know. And, so I had that at the back of my mind. And then, one day, Georgia and I had this like amazing, like really long conversation about the show, how it was going to appear. And I was on my way to Scotland when I was writing the notes. And I was thinking, what's the title of the show going to be, the title? And I knew it had to be The Living. And I knew it needed that like literary kind of feel, the living, but I didn't know what the second part was going to be. And I just kept writing the living and the living and the living and eventually I got to stale. And I think sometimes the meaning of the title is kind of understood. I understand it retroactively. I let the show sit, I return to it, and the show is maybe a very extravagant way of understanding the meaning of these four words somehow. There are quicker, maybe more economic ways of understanding the meaning of the living and the stale. But I think for me it was like, okay, this show is going to help me understand. So yeah, that's maybe my relationship to it.
Thank you for that. It's a very generous response to a titling of a show, because I think sometimes, the titling of things are really difficult, whether it's the titling of writing or exhibitions or, works in general, because it draws up so many different connotations and images. And I was thinking, I think when you said this, the living and the, naturally in my mind, I go to the living and the dead. So I kind of find it quite fascinating that you went with the living and the stale, because it kind of, in a way, for me, points to this idea of like dying livingly. We sort of talked about the kind of the compost, that there's so much life that's still happening in its decay and in its rot. And there's a good way, a good bad smell and a bad smell. So I just wanted to come back actually, because your play on words, but also your kind of literary and also literary kind of references, but also I can see a lot of play in words in the body of the show. And I know that when we met previously, you also talked a little bit about your process, and I just thought maybe that would be important to kind of bring up here in terms of the process of writing and how that affects what you've made in the exhibition.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess also I come to like art making and contemporary art or whatever through writing poetry, maybe like being aware of the fact that I'm writing poetry, maybe from like my early teens, and then getting to a point in that, kind of writing as and when, but getting to a point in that where I felt like there's a precision that is lacking in this work that can, in my mind, this is not a blanket statement, but in my mind, can only be achieved through making art and through process, and that an element that's essential, I think, within my work is like learning something new through, with friends or with, whoever's kind of willing to teach me something, learning something new, so that there's like a very specific language that becomes kind of imbued into the things that I'm writing, whether it's like, working with a carpenter and understanding the kind of layers and beauty of grain that I would otherwise not know. And that can now be used as this very like robust kind of metaphor from which to work. And so that's how I kind of came to art, was through the necessity to find some sort of like precision, to like aim for precision and arrive there through like making work and then writing. And with this show, I had some writing that I'd already kind of done, but it was like, some writing you have, you're like, you could just stay at the back of my hard drive forever. And then actually, on the suggestion, we had these meetings, the group who had these were going through this development program, myself, Rooted, Zine, and Emily Hetz. We had these meetups every few months that were like these very like gorgeous kind of discursive and very generous and like loving conversations. Georgia and Bryony were present, and Sophie was there for I think maybe the last one. And in one of those chats, I was talking, and Bryony was like, "Samra, why don't you go to Uganda?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, I can do that." So then I did go to Uganda, and then all the writing that I didn't want to put in the back of the hard drive started to arrive. And even the way that I was reading those older texts started to shift, and this metaphor of the crocodile started to arise. I think mostly because I was now back in a context that I had, very honestly, had been a source of like joy and strength, but also simultaneously the site of fear as well. Because of going back to Uganda and having this very sheltered, I think many people of the diaspora, various diasporas, can relate that you kind of go back to your home country like a pope, like in your bulletproof car, and like you don't, and you also then internalize that kind of fear, and that place becomes symbolic of fear. So then that kind of corner of the writing started to come through, acknowledging maybe and starting to see and and starting to draw and write and attach imagery to that notion of like simultaneously a place of strength, but also a place of fear. So I say all of that to kind of get to the point that like, this is how I arrived of like writing being part of the process, but then there's also this thing of like being roused deeply by this place and coming back with a new kind of perspective on what I had written, and then this new kind of writing that then became like the basis or the logic of the show, or like a manual for the show. It was like every single room in this gallery has a chapter that still exists in my hard drive, but every room has a kind of chapter that I was drawing on, that Georgia was drawing on, that we kind of drew on as a manual or a logic for the show.
So, and does that writing, is some of it manifest in the exhibition as writing, or is it manifest as installation or film or object or drawing? Does some of the writing actually appear?
Yeah, so in the film, the beginning of the film, when it says long bark, long basson, long poopery, that's a poem that appears in the 6th chapter of the text. And then there's the text, and then there is the main text, which is also called The Living and the Stale. And then there's a text of references, which are like words that recur in the text. And within there, there's they're like a series of definitions for like a roller coaster or tarot or crocodiles. And in there's a definition of the roller coaster, which then became the basis of like, how can I begin to present this within a space? There's a short script about a young boy who on hearing or thinking that he's heard that people are coming to take from his house, he removes the tiles, he removes the windows, he removes the window guards from his own house so that someone else would not take them. And then that became the kind of basis of the second gallery. And then in the third gallery, the part of the script of the film that didn't actually make it into the film, because I thought actually I'd just rather it be a space, but the text appears in the space, and the room itself is the set or the scenario that I imagined this action would take place within. So yeah, each kind of room is drawing from or includes somehow some of the text, but like in kind of different ways.
Yeah. We'll come back to the staging in a minute. I wanted to first maybe, because I think one of the questions I was trying to ask myself while going through the exhibition was, who was the protagonist of this film? If we see it as if I see the exhibition as an expanded idea of what a film might be, who becomes the protagonist, whether I'm the protagonist or whether you're the protagonist, or whether this Ham Mukasa is the protagonist of the film. I wonder if you could tell me a bit more about Ham Mukasa, because he's mentioned as the central figure in the main body of the text. But actually, as I move through the spaces, I find that you're revealing more of yourself, and I actually don't see Ham as much. So I'm curious to see where you see Ham, or whether he's just somehow a kind of guiding light or principle in the making of this exhibition.
Yeah, I love that. Well, I think, so Ham Mukasa first is like this, he's the secretary scribe of the, what is effectively like a prime minister of Uganda. So in Uganda, there are like various tribes, and the most dominant, still now, but in the early 1900s, the most dominant tribe were the Baganda, or at least the most kind of like aggrandizing of the Baganda. And so their prime minister is called Apollo Kagwa, and the secretary scribe of the prime minister is called Ham Mukasa. And in 1902, they leave Uganda to come to England for Edward VII's coronation. And the idea is that Apollo Kagwa, the prime minister, is kind of supposed to be like orating the journey to Ham Mukasa, but actually the text itself is really his perspective on what it is.
Ham's perspective.
Yeah,
okay.
On what he's seeing.
Okay, I see.
So, you know, they leave Uganda, which is, you know, is the interior, and they go to Zanzibar, which is like this bustling coast, you know, and then they make their way up through the Suez Canal, and at points they dock and they meet kind of like these amazing like Somalian acrobats that kind of come on the boat and like trick everyone. And Ham is, you know, he says in the book, he's like, I don't understand how these black people are acting so crazy in front of all these white people on this boat. And he's shocked because he's like, I would never. And he, you know, he's thinking that's so wild. And then he, you know, but then at points he takes on these anti kind of German sentiments, which the editor of the text attributes to a kind of him associating or aligning himself with Britishness, and his opinion of the German people on the boat is like a really horrible kind of, why are they acting like this? Oh, you know, he says things like this. But then they find their way to Egypt, they get to Italy, they go to Southampton, they dock, then they move all around the country. They go to Sheffield, they go to Manchester, and you know, at one point he goes to Manchester and he's like, he says, I've never seen women work so hard in my life. And he even asks, like, why do they work so hard? And when he's in London, he's like, he uses this kind of biblical imagery, and he says, you know, it's like all these people like locusts or something. And he when he sees, you know, these kind of fantastical, what in my imagination are these fantastical Victorian inventions, it just blows his mind. And that, my intention, I think, when I was like wanting to read the text was like, what was the perception of, you know, pre-internet, you know, I don't know, the circulation of like text or media or literature? How did these people, these travelers from Uganda, who have taken, you know, perhaps a more convoluted journey than my parents, or as, you know, more convoluted journey than, you know, many migrants, but how did they perceive this country in this moment of a historical kind of juncture where we're moving from the Victorian period and the Industrial Revolution is really starting to die down, and we're going into the Edwardian period, but at the same time, the effort within the colonies is also still kind of, it's still active, it's still going. How did they perceive this? And I thought, I had one idea of like, oh, you know, this, I'm going to be very critical, I'm going to engage with it on this level. But actually what I was most interested in are these fantastical kind of descriptions. You know, the first time he sees the circus and the way he describes it, you know, a woman rolls out and the elephant sits on the woman, but she's not bothered, and these kids flip, and, you know, all these, it was these kind of like, kind of flamboyant descriptions that I loved. And so in a way, I thought Ham Mukasa would appear more in the work, but I think the things that I kept returning to were these like very poetic, flamboyant, lovely little descriptions of these sights, like these things to him that were just like, what? But it's also kind of symptomatic of, you know, something else, the fantastical, the beautiful. But I thought, similarly to this writer that I love, Jennifer Nansubuga, who in her kind of text called Kintu, she just, it's a history of, it's like an origin story, but the history of this guy Kintu from like the 1400s till the 2000s. But in that text, she skips the colonial period, and I found that powerful. And I thought, okay, no, I'm going to engage with the fantastical because we know what's going on at that point. I'm almost taking that for granted somehow. And it's more a device. Ham is a device. His perception is a device, focusing on the fantastical, the colours, the suspension of things, the little details, and because he never really speaks about the violence of the moment. There are little inklings. Maybe I'm reading into those or projecting onto the text, but he doesn't speak directly to it. And I also found that kind of powerful, you know? So I suppose, yeah, that's...
But in the reading of the text, were you able to decipher who because Ham's described effectively, but were you able to decipher whether it's really Ham that's kind of speaking to you through that writing, or whether it's, yeah?
Oh, well, I mean, the opening of the text, because it's commissioned by the Church Missionary Society.
Right.
And the opening of the text, I think, like, the chair of the society at the time says, you know, these lovely people, they've come to England, we're so grateful. But there have been some bits that don't quite agree with an English sensibility, and those have been removed.
Oh.
And I had this desire to find the manuscript, and initially I spent, like, when I was first got this commission, I spent maybe like the best part of 8 months looking for this manuscript and really struggling to find it, because I wanted to know what was unsaid, and my Luganda, I don't know, 20th century Luganda, how much it differs from what I know, but I had this confidence that, like, if I got the text, I could find the gaps, but I, couldn't quite locate it. So I was always I wasn't so trusting of the text also.
And so what does that mean then for how you navigated this exhibition, or how, because you then went through this process of writing, you said you created several chapters, and then those chapters in a way determine the kind of staging, because that's what I felt. There's two things I felt. One was actually, I was really struck by the kind of boundaries or barriers and how you're moved in a certain way through the space. I mean, sometimes in a very gentle way. So in the atrium space, you can't see directly, what's happening there. So I kind of, walked around, but then found myself going into the first room, but also those proper barriers, those that are kind of where there's a box. Hopefully the crocodiles are not in the building and haven't escaped. But there's these sort of holes. I have trypophobia, by the way. So I was like, when I was listening to your narrative of trypophobia, and I was like thinking, I hope there's not going to be like a space with lots of holes, because I'll have to avoid that room. But yeah, so it was sort of kind of this playful story about these crocodiles and the eggs, and this notion of what hatches, does the hatch of I'm getting it completely confused myself, but whether the crocodile, cracking the egg, the sort of hatching, this kind of duality of like, what is it that is at play here is something that I was kind of, I was drawn to in the drawings. You can sort of see that in the drawings that you have on the wall. But also those eggs come back at the end of the show as well. So, could you talk a little bit about this? Because you sort of talked about the metaphor of the crocodile, but also the kind of mythologizing of them being part of the Uganda. Is it the Ugandan scene? Is that the story that we're hearing? Because that was something that wasn't clear for me.
In the atrium space?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, because where did the crocodiles come? Really, the crocodiles came in when I was in Uganda.
Okay.
And I felt, the space in which the film is shot in the Uganda Museum, next door, there's a society called the Uganda Society that was set up in like 1904, with around the time that Uganda becomes a protectorate. I think specifically for the study of like science, culture, various like topics within the country, and then people would discuss it, and it was based at various sites, and then eventually here. But they have in that society texts that were like brought from England or from wherever that are still there. And there was a text in there that was called like Uganda's Beasts or something, and it had all these really gorgeous etchings of crocodiles, and the description of the crocodiles as these like ossified, like squealing, like scary creatures, I really loved, and I could relate to somehow, I don't know. And whenever I would go on these kind of excursions, I always had this thought that there are creatures everywhere, and there are crocodiles everywhere, and it's going to be the crocodiles that eat me. And I was developing this like irrational fear of being eaten by a crocodile. But I don't feel. I don't feel like crocodiles feature, to my knowledge anyway, within a kind of Ugandan mythology, but I think I started to mythologize the crocodile because I felt that this part of the show that's about like a kind of introspection and this, what is the thing that it exists within you. The shape of it became a kind of crocodile, and I liked that it's kind of repulsive to me. It's a little bit scary. It squeals. The sound of crocodiles are, quite frightening and also disturbing. And I liked that as the shape of something within me. And I began writing those kind of texts and building that mythology around the crocodile because I thought that's me. And I had before most exhibitions, apart from this one, I usually have a tarot reading. Just because I think it soothes me somehow. I think it's like my exhibition traditions, and it soothes me. And the one that I had a show just after my dad passed away, and the tarot reading before that, my tarot reader said, "Samra, you've got to focus on horses. You've got to really focus on horses."
That's hard to do in London.
You got to just keep your focus on horses. And I'm not really an animal lover, like someone, even when I was a kid, I didn't really like have animal toys or engage. I'm not bothered about them. So I started to think, but which is odd because also humans are animals, So I started focusing on horses, and the horse became symbolic of my father, and the snake became symbolic of my mother. And then I think I was looking for my animal also. When the crocodile came about, I was looking for my animal, and it became the crocodile, I think, because I was frightened of it everywhere any kind of body of water that I went to in Uganda, I was worried about it. And then I found this book, and the first page I opened was the crocodile with these gorgeous etchings. And then it was like, it's me. It's me. This is the shape. And then the myth starts to build. And I, I want to extend it and see who else is a crocodile. But yeah.
I'm not a crocodile.
You're not a crocodile?
Yeah, just to let you know.
What's yours?
I'm... This is not about me. Anyway, moving on. So I just wanted to pick up on. First of all, are crocodiles in Uganda? Can you find them?
Oh yes, you can. So
it's not okay. They are okay.
There is the Nile crocodile, but when I was on the Queen Elizabeth Park, which is in western Uganda, the Kazinga Channel that connects Ugandan waters to the Congolese waters, there weren't crocodiles there initially, but they were introduced.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I was told that story, and then I kind of thought, okay, there's another crocodile story for me. Mm-hmm. They were introduced.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I just wanted to pick up on the sound, because you were just talking about the sound of crocodiles, and I was just thinking about a sound that's in the show that's quite. I think it's one that I don't know if you've recorded something and you've stretched that sound. It's in the third room, I think, before you enter into the film. Maybe it's not the third room. Maybe it's the fourth room. So before you enter into the film. There are two monitors and a speaker, and then there's the image of the two state dignitaries, I think. Yeah. And then there's this kind of morphing of sound that happens in that space, and I just wanted to hear a bit more about the production of that and or how that comes about, in your work. Because I don't think there is a part that it features a little bit in the film, so I don't know if it was something that you had produced for the film and then you brought it into this installation, but I was just curious to hear a bit more about it. Yeah, I think that is... I had these recordings of different crocodiles, and I... Actual crocodiles? No, not that I had recorded them. Okay, no, I just kind of appropriated these recordings because I'm deeply frightened of them. Yeah. And then kind of played about with them, like trying to make a kind of melody from them. Okay. And then use that as a sort of motif within this work and within the film. And within the third room, there's like a kind of secret podcast that you kind of hear but you don't, and it features as the tune within the podcast. So it sort of recurs. Just to keep the crocodile there, Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll look out for him in your further shows. Okay, so I would like to talk a bit more about the film and the making of the film. So you, what year did you go to Uganda to make the film?
I left in December of 2021.
And did you have a clear idea as to what you were going to make when you... No. Okay.
Not
So
really.
how did you... Because you talked about how the text somehow started to come back to you while you were in Uganda.
Oh no, I've got my timeline wrong.
No,
I went
okay.
initially in 2021. I stayed for 3 months.
Okay.
And then in September of 2022, that's when I made this.
So you
film.
came back.
I went back.
Wow. Okay.
And I wrote, in the first trip, I would go, I would basically kind of use the museum as like an office somehow, and the Uganda Society, and I would go there every day to write, and I would sit in each space of the museum and I would write every day, more or less for 3 months. And then when I kind of collated the writings, I could sort of see, oh, there's kind of an action here and there's this, but it doesn't really make sense. But there's a shape somehow of something, and actually just the shape is, I think, somehow that it's in this film. It's everything is contained within this space. And then I went back then in the September 2022, and I had like a few days to just kind of get a crew together, and luckily I'd made a lot of friends the first time I went, so I could kind of draw on like poet friends and different arts organizations, and all my artist friends just like, help me, I need to make this film. And I had a relationship with the museum because I was going there all the time. They sort of knew me somehow.
Oh, yeah, 'cause I was going to ask you about that, because I the last scene I saw, the curator or the director was basically telling you to leave. I was like, did they not ask for permission? And now she's in the film.
Yeah.
So they knew about the film.
Yeah.
Okay.
But she kicked us out nonetheless.
Okay, good.
Yeah. So I've sort of formed a relationship with them, and yeah.
And so is it 4 scenes?
Yeah. Yes.
And so those scenarios that you kind of draw on, actually, because I don't know where the beginning was or where the end is, and actually that's something that I have to say, in the narrative that I heard, I had the same feeling where I couldn't really tell what the beginning of the narrative was and what the end of the narrative was. So I was thinking about that similarly in the film, that there is this element of not necessarily having a particular beginning in that film or an end, but you knew what the scenes were, the vignettes were in a way. So there's the first one I entered into. There was a scene of mourning that was happening, and I think the last one was the museum director telling you to leave. And I was really struck in the beginning, so I didn't know that you had this intentionality of being able to see the elements that make the film. So there's you as the viewer, I'm not only seeing the director and the other people that are kind of working behind what we should not normally see, but also the actors kind of laughing, getting out of character, and your the directions that you're giving them. So you're kind of all of the layers that are not always visible to us as the viewer are exposed. So this kind of exposing of this film is happening. This expanding of this film is happening. In the relationship between the writing and the making, did you know at the beginning when you were kind of making the film that you wanted that kind of exposure in terms of the different layers, you being in the film, others who are helping you make the film, it be in the film as well?
I think partially, but then there were certain elements when we were actually in the space, I think due to heat, which is a factor that, like, if anybody makes a film in a hot country, you actually really have to think about, because it made everybody a bit delirious by the end of the day, and they just couldn't engage with me. And but then it became a bit more playful. The middle of the day was extremely stressful because we needed the light for that scene where they're underneath. There's Uganda Museum has this gorgeous architectural feature where the central kind of area that you walk into has this, like, I don't know, like all the light comes through the middle of it. But I kind of knew the point in the day when it would leave. And so there was there was optimism in the middle, at the beginning of the day, the stress of the middle of the day, the delirium of the heat. And I think that kind of produced another layer that I wasn't prepared for, but I loved. And but as I was writing it, I knew that I wanted to have these slippages and I wanted to have these moments, but there were some that were like very improvised. But I think it kind of sits within this wider ambition that I have to really perfect that slippage, that continual slippage in a film, because I don't know, I feel there's like I don't know, I just love that fragility of the film, where it's like you yourself as a viewer, but also you as a maker, you become kind of vulnerable and you're like heavily reliant, but also unsure, and actually a lot happens in the editing in terms of the meaning making, and you're just sort of following this process where you just keep slipping in and out of the illusion. And even the crew at times would be like, oh, I get it now. And then like an hour later, be like, nah, I don't get this again. I don't get this again. I got it. I had it an hour ago, but I don't get this. Or I'd be like, guys, should we read that again? You know, like everybody keeps slipping in and out of the logic. And I love that chaos. That chaos, that wasn't, so partially intentional. And then I think 70% unintentional, I'd say.
There's an element of film where you also use this, I guess is it a slower exposure? I don't know enough about film, but is it where, because you can see the body moving and the trace of the body moving. And you also talk at one point about, your mother sort of talks about haunting. So there's this, for me anyway, there is an element, I have to say, it has a kind of religious aspect as well, even though you're in a museum. Maybe it's also this thing of the wearing of white. I don't know. There was something in it that had this, or maybe not religious, maybe it's spiritual. Maybe I could describe it as that. But yeah, I was curious about the technique of exposing. Is it video you're using, or is it film? Because that's one thing I wanted to. Is it digital? Is it video?
Yeah, it's just at one point I just use I have my digital camera on me all day, and then I just kind of, the point where like I need to go and sing and kind of cross this threshold somehow. I just thought I want to keep the camera on and capture the face of the boy as I walk past him. So I just left it on, and that was why. That's how that came in. But it's just a very bad digital camera.
Well, you made a great film with a bad digital camera. So the last thing I wanted to touch on was the element of drawing within the exhibition, because obviously you draw on the walls. There's a lot of mark making on the walls. There's drawing and notation in almost actually every room actually. And it seems as though you have this kind of daily practice of writing and drawing. And that either there is elements of figures or images emerging. So this crocodile, I didn't understand it as a crocodile when I first saw the images, and then I listened to the story and I went back and I was like, oh, it's crocodile. Actually, it kind of, I have to say, there's something eerie in the shakiness. Actually, the kind of that you use in your drawing. You kind of sometimes have this kind of shaky line that you use. So I just wanted to ask you, a little bit about because it seems as if there's also pencil lines and that you're maybe drawing over with a pen. I wanted to just hear about your process of drawing, and I think that would be great to know more about.
Yeah, I mean, I think I always had this kind of drawing practice, but I always pushed it in a way to the back. I think mainly due to a shyness, because I think when I go to shows, I think the thing that I love to see and really sit with are drawings. I don't know, somehow. And so I had kind of revered them, and I thought, I can't do that. But then I've been slowly kind of moving them to the front, because they are like an instruction. And I think with this show in particular, the way that I worked on it is that I never like work into any drawings. I just keep making the same drawing over and over and over again and adding new things. And with those drawings in the atrium, I I had them for a long time, like in pencil, and then I don't know why I did that. I don't know why I went over them, but then when they actually came up to Leeds, a few days before the show, I just thought, okay, I wanted to maybe, I don't know, wanted to re-engage with it somehow. I don't know. So then I kind of went back into them, and then I guess in all the other spaces, they're all drawings that have existed for a while that I then kind of worked into in the last few weeks before the show. That they've been sat there and I've been thinking about them, and then they kind of worked into. But I suppose my relationship to drawing, similarly to the writing, is this kind of instructional quality, or they exist in my studio as diagrams, or the expression of some sort of logic that I don't quite understand yet, and then similarly to the writings, they kind of come out as a roller coaster, or they come out as these kind of figures on the floor that are then kind of worked into. They're I suppose a template for a further exploration. I think, yeah, that's them.
I wanted to open up if there are any questions from the public. Oh, we've got a nervous audience. No questions. You got a question? Yeah, great. I tried to get away from the question. Do you know what animal you are? Okay. But we were talking earlier, weren't we, about the interior life, and there are some things in our interior that we maybe even hide from ourselves and don't want to address. We know it's there. So it's quite interesting. So my my animal is actually a bird, and you want to know what kind of bird, don't you?
It's cool because we were speaking about interiority on the train, so we're getting into it. We're like,
yeah. So I don't know why I'm embarrassed to share my animal with you. Well, I think it's a kestrel. And the reason I think it's a kestrel is I think I saw a kestrel when I was in Amsterdam, and we had a moment, and then my friends were like, a kestrel in Amsterdam? And I was like, no, I saw one, it came to me. Before that, friends used to call me, I have a friend who was, she thought I was more like an owl. I would love to be an owl, but I don't think I'm knowledgeable yet enough to be an owl.
You are. I feel like...
No.
No? Okay.
No. But, we're getting there. We're working towards it.
Owl status.
Yeah, but I like the kestrel because it was quite sort of stoic and sort of, also probably working towards that. Anyway, it's tangent. Any other questions? Yeah.
I'm quite interested in what you said about Samra and the fact that you didn't have to tell me before the show.
I know.
How did that make you feel like entering into doing this show?
I think it was okay not to do it, but I love it because I just love narrative, you know, and I love how people conjure narrative, you know, or every writer has a different process. And to me, like tarot readers are like orators, that this is their process of conjuring. And I think like beforehand, I was a little bit nervous because I don't think it's like a good luck thing. It's more of a grounding process, you know? And so I just felt like, okay, it's going to be all right, Samra. It's not happening. We tried to arrange it. It didn't work out. We couldn't find the date. We tried. It's okay. I'll be fine. And it's fine. I think it's okay.
Have you done more drawings of other tarot cards that you get? So I really like the one that keeps in the show and just interested, like, is it CDs? Have you done more sort of take on them?
I mean, I've got two that this was like part of a series of 3, and I didn't include the other 2, but the other 2 are still like just very faint sort of line. So I think I'll continue with them. I haven't thought about them so much, but like I would quite like to. Yeah, I think I would quite like to make some more, and for them to maybe be used somehow.
Do you think the Tetley space is quite a unique building in terms of it's not like a huge white gallery or like big open spaces? Do you think that you found it quite a useful space to bring this narrative life, or do you think you would have been able to achieve the same thing in like a content, like a, you know what I mean, like a white TV space?
I had a conversation very, very early, like as soon as I knew I got the commission, with one of my really good friends, Sam Luncheon, and I was like, Sam, because I feel like we've been to, maybe since we've lived in Leeds, with like maybe 70% of the openings, and it's like either, and we had this big chat about the space basically, and he was just like, Samra, you either deal with it or you ignore it, hun. But we're not talking about it anymore. It's like, deal with it or ignore it. That because we kind of talked through different shows, and it's like, that's the tactic. Deal with it or ignore it. And I was like, I want to deal with it because I love wood. And wood to me is like, especially when it comes up on the walls, for me it feels, in my mind it's synonymous with like a kind of womb, not like a real womb, but like this space of, you know, like birth is about to happen or something. And so I thought I want to try my best to deal with it, and this, I suppose, strategy of like chaptering and creating chapters was perhaps like one way of like trying to deal with it. But yeah, I did try my best to like engage with it, and I think since then I think it's really like this year I would like to do a few group shows with friends. And I specifically want to be in spaces that aren't white cube spaces, you know, like, and I feel like, yeah, it's probably been done before, but like, how do we engage with or intercept a pub? And maybe for it to just be ignored, or for it to be like dealt with, or do we change the carpets and that's an artwork or something? Like, I want to continue to work in spaces that perhaps aren't like white cube spaces. And also upon realizing that, like, I don't think in my art career or practice that I've probably worked in more spaces that are like unconventional contemporary art spaces than the conventional spaces, and I prefer those because you have a material, you have a history, you have a kind of you have material to work with already, and now have a conversation with, and you can, so in my mind, I'm like, okay, I'm going to treat this almost in the way that I kind of treat a group show, where I'm excited for the dialogue between materials and works. The material is the building, which is, you know, like imbued with its own history that we kind of know and we are aware of, or we're not, and it might just be the light or the actual material of it. So I guess that was, yeah, my thoughts.
I feel like in the show there's a motif going through of like concealing things and then revealing things at different points, both in like the film, but then also the drawings and the like not revealing and not knowing where they are and then like rebuilding.
Yeah. I mean, again, this
Hopefully nowhere. Hopefully nowhere in the building.
Rah!
Yeah.
I guess on this, like when I went on this kind of research trip in Uganda, I became aware of or interested in, or like implanted within my family that live in Uganda, who I don't know very well, and became, or like not so well, and I became kind of aware of a few things, like aware of like in my own writing, how I'm like concealing certain things from myself. Like I might be kind of cognizant of it, but don't want to write on the page. I became aware of like my family's history and things that have been spoken about or unspoken about, and things that I've had to kind of research myself. And actually perhaps they're not hidden, you know, they surface in other ways. And so similarly to the kind of conversation we were having on the train, I was writing a lot about, or at least my writing was revealing this dynamic between like what I choose to hide, what is hidden from me by myself, that at points surfaces, and like what is my, you know, just my interior world, what is the kind of room within which I inhabit and live. And I was just aware, became aware of those different kind of realms. And I'm sure there are other dimensions of, like we were sort of speaking about other dimensions of interiority, but I was sort of focused on those, and I suppose by extension also aware of like ways in which I perhaps edit myself as a mode of hiding, you know? And so I think I was just sort of aware of and thinking of that as like a very sort of personal element, but also something that maybe surfaces in work. And this maybe dynamic that I think some artists experience, myself included, where it's like your work is deeply personal, has this kind of autobiography is a material of the work, and I think within that realm of art making there is always that question of what does one reveal of yourself, and what do you not. So I think maybe part of that is like part and parcel of the kind of realm in which I think I make work, or from which I make it. Yeah. Thanks.
Very last question, and that is the very funny voice in the gallery for film.
Yeah.
It's really funny and difficult to ask where that came from, or characters that, or just a little white.
I think we were also having this conversation on the train that like I realised in the past few weeks that like I think I'm a clown, and I think I identify with like clowning and clowns, and like somehow, and there was a moment again of like, I've been in the studio forever, it feels like, I don't know what I'm doing, and I had this script and I was feeling so tired of reading this script that was like a kind of historical account of Hamukasa and his journey and my thoughts on it and my thoughts on cotton and the intersection between cotton and bark, and it really was starting to make me feel very heavy. And so then I thought, okay, what about if I just do it in different voices with different intonations and start to kind of inhabit whatever comes kind of through me, this like more sort of improvisational voicing thing, what will happen? And I then realized that once I started reading it like that there was this internal fight, because I was like, why are you sort of undermining what is actually a very important history? And then the other one was like, go on then, tell your story. And it's like, well, no, you've already started. And the other one's like, well, no, this is very important. And, you know, this is important. And this was the sort of internal kind of tension within me of trying to, and I don't know whether I don't think that I've kind of got it yet, because actually these things are very sensitive. And so like humor around it has to, I think, I don't know, has to be done like very well. But I don't know, I think I'm like starting to think about how humor or the element of clowning can kind of live within this realm of like quite both important but also still lived kind of violence of the specific stories that I'm telling. I don't know, yeah. But I feel like this is maybe a newer corner of my art practice, but I think it's like a very established part of myself, but yet my work doesn't kind of usually feature this thing, but I want to work on that, how it can shift and move and change things, because when I did this in the studio, I felt a certain attention to what it was I was saying that I didn't have when I was just reading it in my kind of quite respectful, need to engage with this, I've done this research, let me talk about it way. And when the voices started to come in, I could feel the internal like fight or argument within me that like, you know, like, I don't know, I don't even really know what the central question is, but I could feel this dynamic within me as I was reading these voices. So, yeah, that's the...
Yeah.
So, yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. The show is actually open until the 4th of June. So if you haven't seen it, then please make time to have a look. And a huge thank you also to Jerwood Arts, who have funded this show, but also Rooted's show and Emily Hess's show. We actually launch a new show on the 23rd of June. So please join us for the preview on that day for Afra Isma's show called Splashdown Tender. Otherwise, thank you so much for such a hilarious and insightful talk, Samra and Sepake. It was incredible. Thank you. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.